the reality of a small business in Canada. So in this video, we're going to talk about 5 facts about operating a small business in Canada. This is how you know if this video is for you. 2 things. 1, you have experience already running a business. Okay, so you understand about running a business. And also, you are from an emerging country and you're thinking about coming to Canada. So why emerging country is important? Well, for 2 reasons. Because in an emerging country, like my country of origin, business is pretty much conducted a lot through network and reputation. So it's very important to have a good reputation and know the right people and have people in your team that know how to open doors and all this kind of stuff. The second thing is that typically in emerging countries, there's a lot of inequality. There is a lot of inequality in terms of talent, in terms of economics, and this inequality shapes the way that we conduct business on a day-to-day basis. So it's very important. Okay. We have our program, Your Business in Canada. The link here is in the description. Okay, but let's jump at it. So first of all, who is considered a small business? It's important to define that a little bit. Typically in Canada, when people refer to a small business, sometimes it's small, sometimes it's not too small, but let's say around $10 million a year in terms of Canadian dollars, it's considered a small business in terms of top line sales. If a business generates a revenue of less than $10 million a year, it's probably called and considered in Canada a small business. So let's go to the 5 factors. Factor number 1 I want to discuss, access to credit, okay? This is true anywhere in the world where you need history, right? That's a universal truth, okay? People will only lend money to businesses if they believe they're gonna get paid back. That's very true. But one thing that makes things much simpler in Canada, it's how the financial institutions implement their credit policies and their credit concession to businesses. There is typically a document in Canada called the GSA, the General Securities Agreement, which is a document that your bank will ask you to sign, your business to sign, that essentially grants the bank access to all the company's assets in the case that the company doesn't pay. So that generates for the bank a lot of comfort in terms of course, they will only have access to assets to the extent that repays back what you owe the bank, but that gives a lot of comfort and agility in terms of granting some types of credit, right? So it makes everything simpler. Being very specific in terms of credit and financing, we can talk about working capital financing, which is very common, right? Typically you have to produce something to deliver to your clients, but you have to incur expenses before that. That's why you need a working capital financing. And typically Canadian banks, for small businesses beyond a certain size, they will work on something called a borrowing base. So borrowing base where you will have access, given the right conditions with your bank, but you're going to have access to a working capital line or an operating line, how they call it, which the size of the credit you can access is proportional to, let's say, 75% of your total accounts receivables plus 50% of your inventory. And that's typically based on company prepared financial statements in the vast majority of cases. So it's a relatively simple way to measure how much money you can borrow from the bank. You look, if you have an ongoing operation already, you see how typically is my accounts receivable is this, how much is my inventory, 75% of this, 50% of that. It gives you a good estimate of how big is going to be the credit you have access to in terms of working capital. Of course, this is just like to run your business day to day to finance that working capital. You also have other lines of financing like real estate financing. You want to buy a building, or equipment, capital equipment financing. You can buy equipment or you can lease capital equipment. There are plenty of different lenders and different ways to borrow the money. You can pay on a variable interest rate and a fixed interest rate. You can fix for a given period of time. You're going to amortize in a period that is proportional to the life of the asset and all that kind of stuff. There's also acquisition lines that Canadian companies have access to. If they want to buy another business, There's typically like an acquisition line that can be made available for a leveraged buyout or a management buyout. These are little not as common as the working capital lines and the real estate and capital equipment lines, but they also exist. So we can even borrow in Canada to borrow money to buy another business, right? Typically, for any of these, the business will have to provide 3 years of accountant prepared financial statements. Depending on how much money you're borrowing, the bank will require from you more scrutiny by your accountant. There's typically 3 levels. I'm not going to bore you with the details here, but you can see if you want more details, you want to talk to us, you can. And there's typically a lot of credit available in Canada, right? With a relative low interest rate. I say relative because, of course, interest rates have been rising a lot in the last couple of years, but it's still on a global comparison. The interest rates in Canada are still not nearly close to the highest interest rates in the world, especially if you're coming from emerging countries. You're going to see that interest rates in Canada, that every Canadian complains is too high, it's actually not too high compared to emerging countries. Okay, that's all about credit that I wanted to mention today. So let's talk about labor and people that you need to hire. The first thing is the cost of employees and hiring somebody in Canada. You can expect that to be a little bit higher than your country of origin, your emerging countries, because the hourly salaries are typically higher. We'll have higher cost of living in Canada typically, right? But you have lower add-on costs. So typically many countries, yeah, sure, the nominal salary may be X local currency, but then you have to add all these other things, benefits, all these other costs about vacation pay, this and that end up making $1 that you spend actually turn that into almost like $2 or even more in some countries. In Canada, it's a relatively low add-on. Not going to discuss specific numbers here because that changes a little bit depending on the type of benefits you want to offer your employees and all that. But like, it's something that should not scare you in terms of the benefits above and beyond the salary. Typically, it's not going to represent a lot of additional cost. Yes, on a per hour basis, Canadian employee is going to cost you a little more, but no, you don't have to add a lot of additional cost after that, right? Vacation is an important thing because I know many countries in the world where vacation, it's something that, let's say you switch employees on July 1st. Let's say I started a new job on July 1st. In many countries, I have to wait 1 year until July next year, and then only after that I'll have earned my right to go on a vacation. So in other words, you start a new job and you have to work for 1 year without vacation, and then you start working. In Canada, it's not like that at all. In Canada, it is a calendar year vacation rule. So pretty much if I started on July 1st, I'm picking that day because it's exactly the middle of the year, that means until December 31st of this same year, I have the right to take half of my total annual vacations, because half of the year, I'm working for half of the year. And that's how it goes every year. So this is a challenge sometimes. There are many countries where people say, well, the guy just started working, he's already going on vacation. Yes, everybody has the right to have a certain number of vacations over 1 year. And the fact that you switched employers, you have a new job, should not make you a person that can't go on vacation, right? So you will still be able to go on vacation if you switch from one employer to the other. For the employee, that's great. For the employer, a lot of people are like, oh, come on, the guy just started here, barely start to learn anything, he's already going on vacation. Well, that's how the rule is, and that's important to understand. It's very different from many countries. Second thing that's also very different in Canada compared to emerging countries, the benefits that you provide to the employees in Canada tend to be much more flexible with the level of the employee and with the tenure. In other words, in how long the employee has been with the company. So typically vacation, for example, it's going to go by calendar days It's not like if you go on vacation, but there's a holiday in the middle of vacation, there's a weekend. These do not count as vacation days. You have to think about vacation as being an actual business working day that the employee didn't work. That's how you count vacation. But also in this case here for variable benefits, it's very common at a given company, different employees have different days of vacation. So some employees working for the same company will have 2 weeks of vacation. Some employees have 3 weeks. Some may have 4. Some may even have more, 5. That goes with seniority. Typically, how much longer the employee is with the company and the higher their level, they are entitled to have more vacation days. That's a trend, okay? That's not the law. That's not the regulation, but that's what companies have to do to be competitive. It's very market driven. The benefits that you provide to the employees, one of the reasons you have to provide those benefits is so that you can compete with other companies that are hiring and competing for the same talent. So let's move now to cost structure. There's a lot of ground to cover in this video. So cost structure. Cost structure, the two outliers, just gonna talk about the outliers. Yeah, typically you're gonna have the same type of cost you have back home. Cost with people, cost with materials, rent, utilities, your phone bill, and all this and that. So what is typically very different in Canada is two things, okay? Typically in emerging countries, people don't spend too much money on insurance because the insurance in Canada, insurance industry is very well developed, very well developed. So there is insurance for a lot of different things. Commercial insurance that cover things that typically I didn't know about before I moved to Canada 24 years ago, okay? So you can expect to have a higher insurance bill. And you say, oh no, don't worry, I don't want to buy insurance. Well, in many cases, it's not gonna be an option. You will need to have an insurance when you sign a contract with a potential client of yours. Your client wants to know that you have insurance coverage. If your employees are gonna visit the premises of your client, the client will want you to have insurance because if something happens to one of your employees when they're there, right? Or even to rent a room in an office building, your landlord will want your company to have an insurance coverage. Say, well, come on, but I'm just a software company. It's just a bunch of guys sitting on a laptop. Why do I have an insurance for? Well, non-negotiable, people will want to have an insurance coverage because God forbid something happen, somebody lights a fire in the kitchen and there's a fire in the building. So everybody needs to have some certain basic insurance coverage. Cybersecurity in Canada, people are very cautious about security breaches and especially in terms of private information about people, right? So insurance typically is going to be a higher cost in Canada. That's an outlier. What's the outlier on the lower side? Typically, compared to emerging countries, rent costs are going to be lower in Canada. And that was already true during COVID. But especially after COVID, companies really took the advantage of the situation to shrink their office space. And it's very common to people work a few days a week from home. It was already common for many jobs before COVID, but especially after COVID, that became a much more clear trend. Even today, like 2 years after COVID ended, there's a lot of office space that has not been filled again in cities like Toronto, for example. So you can expect lower rent. Why? Because people work from home, and that was already true in many years ago, right? So that's the third thing I want to talk about. It's cost structure. What is the fourth thing I want to mention about small businesses in Canada? Are foreigners welcome? That's a concern people have. Say, well, but I'm here. Am I going to be treated well in Canada? Is there prejudice? I'd say, yes, you are welcome. Yes, Canada is full of entrepreneurs that are immigrants, business owners that are immigrants, decision makers at big corporations that are immigrants. So absolutely, a smart, hardworking immigrant will always be careful here in Canada. But caution, there's no prejudice. I don't see prejudice, but there is caution. Not because people are worried, oh, if you're from so-and-so, you're not from here, so it must not be good. No, but people want to know, like the dreaded phrase that everybody hears in Canada is like, what's your Canadian experience? Yes, people will want to know from your company, what's the Canadian experience? Okay, but that's caution. Just because they want to know if you can perform in this environment is not prejudice, okay? There is definitely a need to fit culturally, right? So your business will need to do business the way business is done in Canada, and that's how we can help too. There's a very large number of foreign entrepreneurs and corporate decision makers, as I mentioned. Canada is also a magnet for global talent, including entrepreneurs. And there is no limit, no cap on what you can reach in the long term in Canada, no matter where you were born. I heard a phrase from a minister from the Canadian government the other day. Canadians are born everywhere, just some haven't arrived yet. And that's amazing. That's very true. As an immigrant who was born outside Canada but lives in Canada for 24 years, that's exactly how I feel. So what comes first when you want to open a business in Canada then? To incorporate the business, to create the business is not your first step. It's not. What you need to do first is you need to articulate very well why your business is coming to Canada. You need to have that story very straight. It has to be clear for you, and it has to be clear in the way you're interacting, communicating with other people. Why Canada? What you're doing here has to be in a way that adds value to Canada, to the Canadian community. And how your company adds value cannot just be high quality and low price. It has to be something very specific that you do that's better than others, okay? And focus on your business's core expertise. Don't try to tell people you do too many things because they won't believe you. They will be suspicious, okay? We have our program, Your Business in Canada, link here in the description. Contact us if you want to learn more. Thank you.